Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In spite of ongoing efforts by the European Union to preserve the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran, some of its member states have demanded a tougher position vis-à-vis what they term as Iran's malign activities on European soil. To discuss this development and its implications on efforts to keep the Iran deal alive, we're joined here in the studio by Mr. Dani Ayalon, who is Israel's former deputy foreign minister and ambassador to the United States. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Meir Javendanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on the latest developments, specifically on this topic.
Well, Jonathan, while you correctly presented the development, let me challenge two presumptions that you made. One is that there is a European Union, and secondly, that it is bent on trying to improve the situation vis-à-vis the so-called Iran deal. We are now in the midst of Britain's problems with Brexit. We don't know yet how it will fan out early this month, what will happen in Parliament, what will happen between Brussels and London. And it doesn't seem as if Iran is at the top of the agenda for either Germany, France, or Britain. And then there is a problem with what Denmark and others have stated after Iranian agents were caught trying to assassinate other Iranian exiles, either in Paris or Brussels or Copenhagen. The problem is Saudi Arabia and its similar tactics vis-à-vis the late Jamal Khashoggi in another European city, Istanbul. You can't have a double standard.
Not an EU member state, however.
But a European country. The membership of the European Union is important, but not vital. The distinction is not relevant here, because if you want to push it further, there is another crisis in which the European countries are involved, and that is the Russia-Ukraine confrontation, in which Russia's main aim is to challenge NATO. Now, NATO and the EU are not synonymous, even though most of the countries are members of both. So if you take all of that together, yes, stating a position that the Iranian regime should be punished, should be sanctioned, this is fine as a declaration. But are the European countries going to marshal their resources in order to fight these malign activities? And by the way, we may see a ceasefire in Yemen between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, who are backed by Iran. This doesn't seem to be a burning issue for these countries. And on top of that, they are not going to give Donald Trump a personal victory, because he has challenged all of these countries, and if they join him, rather than isolate him, they are going to give him a victory on a platter, which they are reluctant to.
Well, it's not entirely relevant. I don't think most Europeans consider Turkey, even though territorially speaking, a big portion of it is in Europe, as part of Europe, or the cultural continent, as they may view it.
But it's a NATO member.
Indeed, it is, since the early 50s.
All the way to Vienna, back a few hundred years ago.
Correct.
Don't tell the Serbs.
Recent. Ambassador Ayalon, when we're talking about the Iran deal and EU attempts to preserve this, Mr. Oren has raised some legitimate questions, also at a time when the European Commission is demanding of Italy to establish reform, and Italy is managing to somehow maneuver itself and challenge European or EU capabilities to demand of its own members to adhere to its policies. Why is this Iran issue so vital for the Europeans? Is it truly in order to stick it to the Americans, so to speak, or is it in order to really bring about its own values, which EU foreign policy chief, even though I question her sincerity in believing what she says when it comes to European security, the connection between Iran and security is really vital to.
Well, partially is about sticking to the Americans, as some would tell you in Washington that the French, for instance, will never forgive the Americans for saving them in World War II. But I think mostly it's economic value for the Europeans at this point, especially the major ones, Germany and France. It is all about markets and exports. And this is the first thing. Secondly is cheap oil. They're afraid that, or they were afraid that embargo on Iran would bring up oil prices. But it doesn't happen. First of all, because the United States now has a great capacity. Now they are number one in oil production, which I think changes geopolitics all over. And we have not seen even the half of the impact. And secondly, Saudi Arabia also has its interest to keep the prices down in order to bring down the Iranian regime. So it is true, as Amir said, Iran is not on the top of the agenda. Iran is also not on the top of their game. And they have been very clumsy in their operations, just as they were clumsy in their operations in Syria, vis-à-vis the Israeli Air Force, and the same thing is with their secret agents in Europe. So there is no sympathy whatsoever for Iran and the Iranian regime, except, of course, the realpolitik from the Europeans. And I believe that at some point, a day of reckoning will come, because at the end of the day, it will be the major European companies that they will not want to lose the American markets. Same thing is with the European banks. So it may take some time, but at the end of the day, I believe they will join, or at least they will, I would say they will comply or acquiesce without actually declaring any big declarations.
Mr. Javendanfar, from the Iranian standpoint, we saw just last week the director of the nuclear organization of Iran, Mr. Salehi, Akbar Salehi, coming to participate in some conference for nuclear energy or energy in Brussels. And while he was invited, and he was also in various conferences in England before that and so on, he voiced several threats to the European, including basically saying that the whole Middle East will crumble into chaos, and there'll be different significant consequences, not only to Middle Eastern countries, but also to Europe if the nuclear deal is not preserved. How much, in Hebrew we say chutzpah, do you need to have in order to come and threaten a continent that is actually actively seeking to preserve a deal that you have a keen interest on maintaining?
I think it was also the deputy foreign minister of Iran, Mr. Al-Arshi, who said that terrorism could return. Look, the stupidity of these threats aside, please allow me to play the devil's advocate here.
Please.
With all due respect to my colleagues here. The Europeans worked very hard for this deal. The Europeans, I under Chatham House rules, I can't name of one of the negotiators with Iran. These are not people who hate Israel. These are not people who have it in for Israel. They didn't to stick it to Israel. No, these are people who were in touch with Israel all the time. We knew exactly what's going on. They kept us all the time informed. They missed many birthdays. They missed many of their families. This was a very long, drawn-out process to reach a deal, to start to build something new. And Trump walked away from it unilaterally. And even though Mossad has revealed some incredible information, which according to newspaper report in Israel, some of the European people who saw it, they saluted the Israeli counterpart. There's nothing that says that Iran was breaking the deal. There's nothing in there that says Iran after the deal was making a nuclear weapon. So after that, we can understand why the Europeans want to keep the deal. And now they're actually the French and the Germans, an update to regarding the French and Germans, they have decided to set up a special channel to do business with Iran. It's called Special Purpose Vehicle. You can do payments with Iran without going through the big banks. Again, this is not because they're anti-Israel. It's because they worked out a very meticulous deal. This was a very big victory for diplomacy, and they want to maintain their efforts. They invested a lot in this. And if Trump would have walked away from that deal after having found out that Iran is breaking it, no matter what we think in Israel of the Europeans, they would have backed walking out of this deal. But the fact remains that Trump walked out of this deal without Iran breaking it. And this brings me back to the point of Salehi, your original questions. The Rouhani government, as much as I think it's incredibly unpopular in Iran right now, and even people say it in newspapers, they say they don't think Rouhani would win 2 million votes if he was to stand election in Iran. By walking out of the deal, they're put in a very difficult position, Jonathan. Rouhani has been saying some terrible things recently. He called Israel a cancer. He called the Saudis camel jockeys. You know, this is one of the most racist terms in Iran used to describe Arabs. And this is somebody who's a moderate and is much better educated.
Considered a moderate. Yeah.
But compared to others, he's a moderate. He's more flexible. Now, why is all this happening? It's because we put them in a very tough position, as reprehensible as it is that he says these things about Israel. And he must be condemned. And he must be condemned that they threaten. But, you know, what do we expect them to do? He has to answer to Khamenei at the end of the day. And this is where we are. And sometimes we see extreme reactions. I don't condone it. I think it's terrible that they say these things. But I can understand why the Europeans want to keep the deal.
Nevertheless, when we're talking about the Trump administration and its decision, it was more of the approach to curb all of Iran's malign activities, whether it be nuclear or its expansionist ideals within the Middle East, which we all know that is very aggressive and is rooted in various malign activities, as they may put it.
You know, I saw the chief negotiator, the American chief negotiator. What was her name? Silver Fox was her nickname. I can't remember her name, the lady. I told her that I'm one of the few people in Israel who backed the Iran deal. I'd like you to come and speak at our conference next year. We hold it in a phone box outside of Tel Aviv. And one of
about Miss Sherman.
Yes, Sherman.
Wendy
Sherman. As one of the few people who supports the Iran deal. My family, just like yours, just like everybody lives in Israel, okay? My children are going to be endangered by the Iranian presence in Syria, just like yours, just everybody else's. We could have sanctioned Iran separately. We could have sanctioned Iran separately. We could have gone after Iran's missile activities. I know there I have problem with Europeans, especially the Italians, but they're coming on board. But understand these are very valid concerns. But the way we went about addressing it by leaving the Iran deal, we have made the Iranian politics even more extremist than I'm not sure.
I'd like to hear Ambassador Ayalon's response to this.
Well, I would say if you ask Trump and his people, or if you ask Bibi Netanyahu, he would tell you, and he would tell Meir, that the danger is in the Iranians keeping the deal. This is a bad deal, and it didn't cover, as you mentioned, the aggressiveness of Iran vis-à-vis its neighbors, you know, subverting in Yemen, subverting, of course, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, all over the place, and also continuing with their missile testing. And basically, they have become more brazen after the signature in 2015 of the Iran deal, when they actually intensified and enhanced their missile activity and testing. So, let alone, of course, the big holes in the agreement itself. And I'm not going to recite it here, but there are many, many big holes about inspection and all that. So in that case, I think Trump really comes with a firm agenda, with a strict ideology and thinking, and he's trying to change what he thinks is a very bad deal.
Earlier on this panel, we heard some say that the Americans actually started negotiating with the Iranians early in order to bring about a better deal. To what degree do you believe that the Americans are actually thinking about it as a strategic approach toward Iran and establishing a new deal that would actually be a more scrutinizing foundation to curb not only its nuclear elements of aspiring or seeking to establish a nuclear arsenal, but also to fulfill its aspirations around the Middle East?
Well, I can tell you that in Israel, at least with the intelligence community and the Prime Minister's office, there is still a very bad resentment about the Obama administration, namely Wendy Sherman and John Kerry.
Why?
Because, first of all, they started these negotiations very secretively without giving us any heads up. They did it, of course, as you know, in Oman. They were not giving, I mean, actually, we found out about it only by, third parties, and they put it as a fait accompli. So in that case, Israel has never accepted this agreement. They were always coming against this agreement, even after it was signed. And of course, the first opportunity, namely the voting in America for Trump, they're doing what they believe, our government is in their first priority and interests.
Mr. Oren?
Well, I fail to understand Danny's point regarding the American secret approach to Iran. It was well known that under Netanyahu, Israel is against any deal which they may reach, and that Israel will leak whatever it learned and will undercut whatever Obama has been doing. So it was, of course, out of self-interest that they kept it secret from Israel, and the negotiations per se are not indicative of anything. Once you reach a draft, then of course you have to submit it and you have to look at it.
Ambassador Ayalon, your response?
Well, my response is that what Amir, my good friend, is citing is the reasons or the reasoning why the Americans didn't keep us in the loop. But that doesn't actually keep them out of the hook about this, I would say, almost crossing Israel and undermining its national security.
Mr. Oren?
Well, under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, when Danny was his chief policy advisor, Sharon had another policy altogether. Israel should not be at center stage. The fight against the Iran nuclear project was supposed to be global. Israel, of course, was one of the intended victims, but Israel shouldn't have led the fight. Now, Netanyahu changed this policy. Many people, by the way, including in the Israeli defense establishment, liked this deal. It gave them stability as they planned their budgets and their entire program for the next several years. And we should remember why the nuclear project was distinct from all the others, including ballistic missiles and malign activities, because it is existential. This is something altogether different than other activities which every country undertakes according to its interests.
Mr. Javendanfar?
Danny, one of the biggest mistakes Iran made, and the Iranians have to, and even Rouhani says it to his credit. Recently, he really disappointed me with these racist remarks, but to his credit, he says it. He says the deal started to unravel the day we started testing and writing things on a missile. That he says it. I have to give it to him. You have to give him credit for that. And yes. And all of a sudden they start, as they say, as my Ashkenazi brethren would say, they started schwitzing, showing off that we are in Syria as soon as the deal happened. And Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah goes on television and he says, I think one of the most destructive sentences in contemporary Iranian history, especially Iranian security: every dollar we get, everything we eat, everything we use comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran. He says it openly. I mean, if that's not basically writing the next set of sanctions against Iran, I don't know what is. I understand all that. But first of all, the Americans, when they agreed to talk to Iran, that they didn't betray us because they just agreed to talk to them. We knew, according to all newspaper reports, we have a reporter here, everything they discussed with Iran in the negotiations. Why is that a betrayal of Israel if they went and agreed just to talk to the Iranians?
Ambassador Ayalon?
Well, first of all, it goes contrary to really a tradition of a strategic coordination and cooperation and pre-consultation before they agree on anything which could be existential for the state of Israel. This is number one. And secondly, it's the substance of the agreement. And yes, absolutely, there are some in the Israeli establishment that see this as the lesser of two evils. Absolutely. But on the other hand, some others see it as kind of a sleeping pill where we can wake up in 10 or 15 years and the Iranians, in a very subversive way, have these capabilities which they do not have now, and this is because of the holes in the agreement. So basically, it's not just a matter of Israel feeling betrayed, but also it's the substance which Israel feels, or at least Bibi Netanyahu feels that it's very much contrary to our interests.
Mr. Javendanfar, as we know, the deal wasn't actually signed, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but it was ratified under UN Security Council.
And it was being adhered to, which is more important than being signed.
My question is this. The UN Security Council resolution that ratified this agreement also requested of Iran not to pursue a ballistic missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads, something that Iran didn't adhere to for various reasons that it said, of course, citing the Iran-Iraq war as its major platform for defensive purposes and so on. But if we look at the Europeans, they looked at this and they have been very vocal, condemning Iran for its actions, and something that also established some kind of foundation of resentment towards Iran, of saying, yes, you might have adhered to the JCPOA, which was not ratified, but what we ratified it with, you don't care about. So what is that going on?
You know, anybody who tells me that the deal didn't address Iran's missile program, as a supporter of the deal, I agree with them. I agree. Okay. But at the end of the day, this was something we could have addressed later on with the additional sanctions.
Why wait?
Wait for what?
Why wait?
There was you see, the problem with the resolution for the sanction with the missile, it was that it was ambiguous in a way that it could be interpreted either way. That I don't want to quote because I'm not, but it was like something along the Iran is requested or something like that. But yes, Iran, especially
called upon
to go and to write on a missile that Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. And what's even amazing is that some Iranians say, oh, it was a rogue group, you know, like the Khashoggi, like the rogue UFO people came and killed him in Iran. Apparently, they will have you believe you can walk on this testing site of IRGC of missiles, put a banner in Hebrew on it, and then take it off, and nobody will know who you are. Anyway, yes, but we could have imposed sanctions, and I have my problems with some of the European countries who we would have had. I'm being honest with you. We would have had problem convincing some of the European countries. I'm being honest with you. But we could have still had majority of the European countries with us to impose tougher sanctions. But Jonathan, let's move on with the JCPOA. It's dead. It's buried. It's pushing up daisies. You know,
however we look at it, the American market is bigger than the Iranian.
American market. Look, the Europeans will keep it alive. But let me just add one more point.
Shortly,
we have to see what happens to Iranian politics because they're calling Zarif could be dismissed. They're going to have a vote of no confidence. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. Iranian politics
because
is
becoming... he was the architect. From the
no, it's because he admitted that there's a lot of money laundering inside Iran. Iranian politics...
Referring to the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif.
Correct. It's become so poisonous, Iranian, and this is to do with Iran, not to do with America, that we have to see what happens there.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to move on to the element of conducting assassination plots of opposition figures opposing the Islamic regime in Tehran on European soil, both an incident in France as well as another incident that occurred in Denmark. The arrests were conducted in Brussels or in Belgium in several locations, and new sanctions as well as legal foundations to start implying more sanctions against Iran based on its activities on European soil, something that has put it in quite of a conflict with various European capitals.
It's a sad state of affairs, but each country defines for itself its national security interests, including the definition of spies and traitors and subversive. Israel kidnapped from Italy, a European country, a renegade nuclear technician, Mordechai Vanunu. That was more than 30 years ago. It didn't kill him, it abducted him, brought him for questioning and then for trial. This was the Israeli way. And the Russians, of course, had this
Also
scruple.
Ahmed Ben Bella.
No, well, the Mehdi Ben Baka thing where Israel helped France is something else altogether. But Israel fought the Palestinian terrorists on European soil. Some Europeans didn't like that either, and we mentioned
Allegedly.
and we mentioned, yes, of course, only allegedly. And some people, and we already mentioned the Khashoggi affair. Now, one lesson of all of our discussion is that Iran is a rational actor. We see that its adherence to what it perceives to be its interest, the deal, means that it is not going to commit suicide by having a nuclear weapon which will threaten Israel. Now, it doesn't mean that Israeli leaders can count on this rationality in their decision making, but we can draw some comfort from it. And just to remind you, Saudi Arabia may now develop a nuclear project.
Closing sentence?
This was my closing sentence.
Ambassador Ayalon?
Well, we have to remember also the departure point of the two sides. I mean, on the one hand of the table, you have Iran, which is really under the yoke of the most severe sanctions, where its economy is almost non-existent and with the ramifications on their political arena. On the other side of the table, you have the six more powerful countries in the world. So you would expect actually that the agreement will be, not in the middle, but where the P5+1 can almost dictate. And the fact that they were giving Iran such a slack, I think is going to bite us. And this is the major fear here in Israel.
Mr. Javendanfar?
When I said the JCPOA is dead and buried, I mean with regards to the Americans, I hope for the sake of Israel, it's kept for what's duration. The Israeli Nuclear Commission backs it. The IDF Chief of Staff backs it. And I think the strength of the deal is that it has international support. If Trump is not reelected, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be in big trouble. But the strength of the JCPOA was that it has the backing of 6 countries. It could be Trump, it could be whoever in ruling these countries. And that's what is making me hope that at least the Europeans will be able to keep Iran on board.
This is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank all our guests here in the studio, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.